The candle had burned down to a stub of blue-white flame, and by its light she held the teacup the way a physician might hold a wound open to the air, carefully, without flinching, though what she had found inside it would have made most women drop it to the floor. It was midnight in November, and the library at Ashworth Hall smelled of tallow smoke and old paper, and the particular cold that settles into stone houses built before anyone thought to keep the damp out. Rain had been falling since supper, a thin, persistent rain that ticked against the window panes like a clock counting something down. She had not noticed the hour, she had not noticed the cold in her fingers either, until the porcelain cracked cleanly along its old repair line, a hairline seam she herself had strengthened only 2 days before, and beneath the false bottom of the cup, wedged into a cavity no wider than a coin, lay a paper folded 4 times over, brittle with age, sealed once and broken since. She had not meant to find it, she had meant only to test the weight of the base against her palm, the way her father had taught her to test any mended thing, to feel for the lie in it before the eye could catch the lie. The cup had told her its secret the way all old, careful forgeries eventually do, reluctantly, and too late for anyone to stop what came next. The door had opened without her hearing it. He stood in the frame in his shirt sleeves, coat abandoned somewhere in the hour since the household had gone to bed, and something in the set of his shoulders told her he had come down for brandy or for solitude, and found instead a woman he had mocked 3 weeks prior, standing over his dead wife's china with a piece of hidden paper trembling between 2 fingers. He did not speak, she did not turn. For the length of perhaps 4 breaths, neither of them moved, and the rain went on ticking against the glass as though nothing in the room had changed, though everything had. She would remember, later, that his face, in that first instant, held no anger at all, only the particular stillness of a man watching a door open onto a room he had spent a great deal of effort keeping shut. What she held in her palm that night was not merely a folded paper. It was the beginning of an answer to a question the whole county had quietly stopped asking, where the Duchess's fortune in porcelain had truly gone, and why a woman with everything had once written, in a hand grown small and careful with fear, words she had never meant a living soul to read. But to understand how a clockmaker's daughter from Bristol came to be standing in a duke's library at midnight, holding his family's ruin between 2 fingers stained faintly with rouge and gilt, one must go back, some 6 weeks earlier, to a morning of hard frost, a broken carriage wheel, and a letter that arrived at the worst possible hour. Bristol that October did not so much begin its mornings as concede to them, gray light seeping through a sky the color of pewter, left too long unpolished, and the rain that fell on Corn Street fell without malice or hurry, the patient rain of a city accustomed to its own dampness. In a narrow shop wedged between a chandler's and a shuttered milliner's, where the sign above the door had faded until only the word Voss remained legible, and even that only if one knew to look for it, a young woman knelt at a workbench with a magnifying loupe pressed to one eye, and a sliver of eggshell porcelain balanced on the pad of her thumb. She was 26 years old, though the coldness of her hands and the care with which she moved suggested someone who had long since stopped counting years as anything but a ledger of small, necessary economies. Her name meant nothing to anyone beyond that street. Her father's had once meant something, Voss the clockmaker, whose regulators had kept time in 3 counties, but the tremor in his hands had begun 4 winters past, and the shop's brass fittings had dulled along with his fortunes, so that now the bell above the door rang for fewer customers each season, and what custom remained came mostly for mending rather than making. She mixed her adhesive from rice paste and powdered chalk, a formula her father had shown her when she was 9 and had thought it a game, and she worked the fracture line of a shepherdess figurine, some squire's daughter's careless elbow, no doubt, with a brush no wider than a whisker, breathing shallowly, as one does around a thing that might still be saved if handled rightly. Upstairs, through the thin floorboards, she could hear her father's cough, wet and prolonged, and beneath it, the smaller sound of the laudanum bottle being set down too hard against the washstand. The coal in the grate had been rationed since Tuesday. She had counted it that morning, the way she counted everything now, the eggs, the candle stubs, the coins in the tin marked Dr. Pembroke, that never seemed to hold enough. She had grown skilled at this work in a manner no one had trained her for, and no one had thought to value. She noticed things, the particular blue-white of true Kangxi glaze, against the flatter imitation whites that flooded the markets now, the way a genuine crackle pattern spread like frost, rather than like the deliberate hairlines of a forger's kiln. It was, she sometimes thought, not unlike her father's clocks, everything a matter of small tolerances, of parts that must agree with one another, or the whole would lose its time. She did not yet know the name Ashworth. She did not know that a letter bearing a ducal seal, delayed 3 days by a broken axle on the Bath Road, was even now making its slow, muddy way toward her door, carried by a rider who cursed the weather and did not yet know what he carried. Her father slept most afternoons now, propped against 2 flattened pillows in the room above the shop, his breath moving through him with the effort of a bellows worked by a tired hand. The physician had used the word dropsical the last time he came, and had used it again the time before that, as though repetition might make the condition less final. He left tinctures that did little, and a bill that did much, and she had learned to nod at both with the same composed face, the one she had practiced so long it no longer felt like practice at all. The shop below smelled of beeswax and pipe clay, and the particular sourness of old varnish lifted with vinegar. She worked there 12 hours some days, her hands steadier than her circumstances had any right to make them, restoring what other men with initials after their names and rooms in London full of certificates, had already pronounced beyond mending. A cracked Meissen shepherdess had come to her from a dealer in Corn Street, who confessed, not without a flush of shame, that 2 established restorers had already refused it. She had returned it within the fortnight, the fracture invisible under her hand, the glaze matched so precisely that the dealer held it to the window for a full minute before he trusted his own eyes. Word of such things traveled slowly in a city like Bristol, through kitchens and back rooms and the murmured exchanges of men who did not like to admit a woman had succeeded where they had failed, but it traveled nonetheless. It was this reputation, earned in silence, spent in coal and medicine, that the letter, when it finally arrived, seemed to have followed like a scent. It came on a Thursday, mud-splashed and travel-worn, delivered by a boy who seemed relieved to be rid of it. The seal was unfamiliar to her, a crest she did not recognize pressed into wax the color of dried blood. She broke it standing in the doorway, the cold air still moving past her ankles, and read the careful, unhurried hand of a man who signed himself cousin to a duke she had never heard mentioned in any drawing room she had ever entered, because she had entered none. The letter spoke of Ashworth Hall, of a collection, of urgency phrased with the particular delicacy of men accustomed to never asking for anything directly. It offered a sum that made her sit down rather abruptly on the shop's single stool, and it asked, no, it did not quite ask, it assumed, that she would come. She read it twice before she looked up at her father's door, still closed, still holding its long afternoon quiet, and felt the strange vertigo of a woman being seen for the first time by people who did not yet know her name, only her hands. She left Bristol on a Tuesday, the 17th of November, with her father's blessing pressed into her palm, like a coin he could not afford to give, and gave anyway. A small brass-cased clock movement, unfinished, that he said would keep her hands honest while she was away from his workshop. The mail coach smelled of wet leather and tallow, of the 11 other bodies who had ridden it before her that week, without airing the windows, and she spent the first hour composing herself against the jolts, the second hour composing herself against the cold, and the remaining 4 hours simply enduring, watching the country change outside the glass from the low huddled roofs of the city to fields gone the color of old pewter, hedgerows dripping, rooks moving across a sky that never once brightened. The fog found her before the house did. It came up from the low ground in ropes, thick enough that the coachman slowed the horses to a walk half a mile from the gates, and she saw Ashworth Hall first as a suggestion, a darker gray within the gray, towers implying themselves before they existed. Closer, the suggestion resolved into fact, a long facade of pale stone gone the color of weak tea in the damp, ivy pulled back in patches, as though someone had begun a labor of restoration and abandoned it part way, a drive rutted deeply enough that the coach lurched, and she gripped the seat with both hands. She counted 4 windows with cracked panes before she reached the door. She did not count the ones that were simply dark, unlit, curtained against use, rather than against light, because there were too many. The housekeeper who opened the door was a narrow woman with a narrow mouth, holding a lamp, though it was scarcely past 3 in the afternoon, and she looked at Adeline's traveling case, small, cheap, the leather worn pale at the corners, with an expression that made no effort to disguise its arithmetic. She did not ask if the journey had tired her. She asked, instead, whether she had eaten, in a tone that suggested the answer mattered only insofar as it affected the household's obligations, and when Adeline said she had not, the woman's mouth tightened further, as if this too were an expense that had not been budgeted. "You'll take supper in the housekeeper's parlor," the woman said. "His Grace does not dine with—" She paused, chose a word with visible care. "Guests, at present." The hall behind her was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season, cold with disuse, with fires unlit in rooms too large to justify the coal. Adeline stepped over the threshold anyway, her case in hand, and felt the particular chill of a house holding itself together by pride alone, the way a cracked bowl holds water for exactly as long as no one asks it to be moved. The housekeeper led her, at last, not to any parlor but down a corridor lined with portraits gone dim under decades of soot and neglect, to a room at the eastern end of the house, where the light, even in late afternoon, fell thin and gray through tall windows. The cataloging room, she called it, though Adeline saw at once that it had once been something grander. A music room, perhaps, its cornices still faintly gilt beneath the dust. Crates stood open on every surface, straw spilling from their mouths like the innards of something butchered, and porcelain gleamed dully within, wrapped in cloth that had not been changed in what looked like a season or more. He was standing at the far window when she entered, his back to the door, and she had a moment, brief, unguarded, to take the measure of him before he turned. Tall, gaunt in the particular way of men who have stopped noticing meals, black coat cut for a body that had since thinned inside it. When he turned, his face held the stillness of a man long practiced at giving nothing away, though his eyes moved over her traveling case, her plain gray dress, her hands, with the same cold arithmetic the housekeeper had performed at the door. "You are the clockmaker's daughter," he said, "not a question." "I am, Your Grace." "And you mend porcelain, for a living." "I do." He said nothing for a long moment, and the silence had weight to it. The particular pressure of a man deciding how much contempt a sentence could carry without becoming unseemly. Then he gestured, with 2 fingers, toward the nearest crate. A gesture so slight it might have been mistaken for indifference, had his jaw not been set so hard beneath it. "My cousin assures me you have a gift," he said. "I confess I expected someone—" He paused, as the housekeeper had paused, choosing the cruelty with care, "more suited to the work. I did not send for a woman who mends teacups for farmers' wives." The words landed exactly where he had aimed them, quiet and precise, no heat in them at all, which was, she understood, what made them devastating. A shouted insult could be forgotten. This one would not be. She did not flinch, though something in her chest drew tight and held. She set her case down beside the door, unhurried, and looked past him at the crate he had indicated, at the pale curve of a vase just visible beneath its straw. "Then perhaps, Your Grace," she said, "you might tell me what a farmer's wife's teacup and a Kangxi vase have in common, before you decide I cannot tell one from the other." His expression did not change, but his eyes did. A flicker, quickly suppressed, the look of a man unaccustomed to being answered. He said nothing for a long moment, and the silence between them had a texture of its own, thick with the smell of dust and lamp oil and the faint sweetness of straw packing. Then, with the air of a man conceding a point he did not believe mattered, he gestured toward the crate. "Prove it, then, before I have my man show you to the door." She did not thank him. Thanks would have been a kind of surrender, and she had none to spare. She crossed the room instead, her boots quiet on the stone floor, and knelt beside the crate, as though it held nothing more consequential than a basket of mending. She drew back the straw with 2 fingers, slow, deliberate, the way her father had taught her to open the back of a watch, never grasping, only asking. The vase that emerged was blue and white, a scene of cranes and pine, rendered in cobalt beneath a glaze gone soft with age, or what was meant to pass for age. She lifted it without ceremony, turned it once in the gray window light, and set it against her palm as though weighing a coin. "Your solicitor valued this piece at £1,100, she said, not as a question. He is a careful man. He is a careful man who has never held a real one beside a false one." She tilted the vase, and the light slid along the glaze, catching in a web of fine lines that spread like the cracking of ice on a pond in early thaw. "This crackle is too even. On a true Kangxi piece it wanders. It follows the clay's own stresses, uneven, almost accidental. This was drawn on, painted into the glaze before firing, to imitate age it does not have." She turned it again, listened to something only she seemed to hear, as her knuckle grazed the rim. "And the weight is wrong. Porcelain of that period is lighter than this. Someone added lead to the paste to make it feel substantial in the hand of a man who trusts his hand more than his eyes." She set it down, gently, as though it had done nothing to deserve rough handling despite its dishonesty. "It is a fine forgery," she said, "better than most, but it is not a Kangxi vase, and it is not worth £1,100, or 11. The Duke did not speak at once. He crossed to the crate himself, looked down at the vase as though it might defend itself, and found that it did not. Something moved behind his eyes, not warmth, not yet, but the particular unsettlement of a man who has built a room out of certainties and just heard one wall crack. "My solicitor examined every piece in this collection," he said, quieter now. "Then your solicitor examined them the way a man examines a face he has already decided to trust." She rose, brushing straw from her skirt with the same unhurried care she had shown the vase. "I would not trust so easily, Your Grace, not with what remains in those crates." The solicitor's face had gone the color of old wax. He had opened his mouth twice since she rose, and twice closed it again, finding nothing there that would not make matters worse. He was a careful man, accustomed to being the most exacting person in any room he entered, and he had not accounted for a woman with flour-dusted hands finding, in a quarter hour, what he had missed across 3 separate visits to the estate. He busied himself instead with his ledger, turning pages that did not need turning, and said nothing further about £1,100. "You will forgive me," the Duke said at last, "if I do not take the word of a stranger over the word of a man I have employed for 11 years. "You need not take my word at all, Your Grace." She had already moved to the next crate, lifting the lid with the same unhurried patience she had shown the last, as though his displeasure were weather she had long since learned to dress for. "You may send the vase to London, to whichever expert your cousin would have preferred, and wait 6 weeks for his letter to tell you what I have told you for nothing, this morning, in your own stable-yard." She paused. "Though I understand the assessors from the Exchequer are not inclined to wait 6 weeks for anything." It was not said unkindly. It was said the way one states a fact about tide tables, or the hour a coach departs whether or not its passengers are ready, and it struck him with more force for that. He stood a long moment amid the straw and the crates, the cold coming off the stone floor through his boots, and looked at her, the way a man looks at a ledger he has been assured balances, only to find, upon checking, that it does not. "December," he said finally. "The assessors come the 2nd week of December to value the estate against what is owed. That gives you—" He stopped, calculating, and she watched him do it, watched the number cost him something to say aloud. "A fortnight, perhaps less." "A fortnight is enough to know what I am looking at," she said. "Whether it is enough to save it, I could not yet tell you." He did not answer that directly. He turned instead to the solicitor, who had found something urgent to examine on the far wall, and said only, "See that she has whatever she requires. Ledgers, keys, the run of the gallery." Then, to her, without warmth but without the mockery of an hour before either, "You will report to me what you find. All of it. Not what you judge fit for my hearing." "I never judge what is fit for hearing, Your Grace," she said, closing the crate lid with a soft, final sound. "Only what is true." He left without answering that. She listened to his boots cross the yard, unhurried, and did not yet know how much that promise would cost her before December came. The gallery, once he had gone, seemed to exhale. She had not noticed until then how carefully she had been standing, shoulders drawn in, as though the room itself required deference. Now she allowed herself to move through it properly, trailing her fingers along the edges of crates not yet opened, reading the faded chalk marks left by some long-departed footman. It was the housekeeper who brought her tea an hour later, unbidden, setting the tray on the one clear corner of the trestle table with the particular care of a woman who had spent decades protecting surfaces from strangers. "You'll want something warm in you before the damp gets in," she said, and stood a moment longer than the tray required. Adeline thanked her, and might have left it there, but the housekeeper did not go. She looked instead at the crate Adeline had closed, at the porcelain within it, visible through a gap in the slats, a pale curve of glaze, a painted branch of plum blossom. "She chose that one herself," the housekeeper said. "In Bristol, as it happens, some dealer's shop near the harbor. She came home laughing about the price she'd talked him down to." A pause. She laughed a great deal, the Duchess. You would not think it, to see the house now, but she filled every room she stood in. Adeline said nothing, only listened, the cup warming her hands. 18 months this Michaelmas, the housekeeper went on, quieter. A fever, sudden, no warning to speak of. One week she was ordering new curtains for the east wing. The next, she did not finish the sentence, only shook her head once, the way people do when a thing is still too near to name plainly. His Grace was not always as you find him. He was proud, yes, and careful of his name, as such men are bred to be. But he was not cold, not until— "Grief does that," Adeline said, carefully. "To some men. To most men it passes," the housekeeper said. "It softens, at least, into something bearable. His has not softened. It has set, like plaster left too long before the trowel comes to it. I have watched it happen, and I could not tell you the day it finished happening, only that one morning I looked at him across the breakfast table and understood he had stopped waiting for it to lift." She gathered the empty tray, though nothing on it had been touched but the tea itself, and paused at the door. "He will not thank you for kindness," she said. "He has forgotten how to receive it, but he is not unkind by nature, whatever this morning showed you. I thought you should know that, before you spend a fortnight in rooms full of things she loved." She left then, her footsteps unhurried down the corridor, and Adeline sat a long while with the cooling tea, looking at the crate, at the plum blossom curling toward a rim she had not yet examined, thinking of a woman who had laughed at harbor prices and was 18 months gone. She began the following morning, and by the fourth day, a rhythm had settled over the north gallery that no one, least of all herself, announced as truce. The footman no longer lingered by the door pretending to have business with the grate. The housekeeper sent up tea at 11, without being asked, and once, unaccountably, a plate of seed cake that no one claimed to have ordered. She worked through the crates in the order they had been packed, cataloging each piece by hand into a ledger of her own devising, cross-checking it against the estate's existing inventory, a slim, leather-bound volume kept, she gathered, by the late Duchess herself in a hand that grew more hurried toward its final pages. It was in that hurried hand that the trouble began. A pair of famille verte dishes, listed plainly enough in the earlier entries. Purchased Canton, 1809, pair, appeared later in the same volume, with a single line struck through, and the word "gifted" written above it in different ink, no recipient named. A Kangxi brushpot she had catalogued herself not 2 days prior was marked in the ledger as "Lost, Fire, East Wing, 1816." Though the estate's own steward had mentioned, in passing, that no fire of consequence had touched the east wing in a decade. She set the ledger down and picked it up again, twice, before she allowed herself to believe what her memory was telling her. She had seen that brushpot before, not this one, its twin, sold at a Bristol auction house 18 months past, described in the catalogue with a chip along the base identical to the one she now turned beneath the window light. A piece cannot be lost and sold both. A piece cannot be gifted and appear, whole and dustless, in a crate never opened since it was packed. She did not speak of it at supper, nor to the housekeeper, nor to the sharp-eyed butler who brought up her candle each evening, with a look that suggested he already suspected her of noticing things. She copied the discrepancies into the back pages of her own notebook instead, in a small private hand, the way her father taught her to record a clock's irregular tick before diagnosing the fault. Not yet the cause, only the symptom, written down before it can be argued away by memory. Rain had begun again by the time she finished, tapping steady against the gallery windows, and she sat with the ledger open on her knee and the ruined brushpot cool beneath her fingers, thinking of a woman who bought porcelain by the pair and, it seemed, disposed of it one piece at a time, quietly, in ways that left no honest trace, and wondering, with the particular unease of someone who mends things for a living, what a woman losses to a fire that never burned. Morning brought no sun, only a paler gray, and with it a small commotion in the east passage that she might have ignored had ignoring things ever come naturally to her. A footman was tugging at the display case nearest the garden door, his knuckles white on a latch that would neither close nor stay open, muttering that the wood had swollen with the wet and someone would have to send for a joiner from the village, a matter of days at least, and in the meantime the case stood gaping like a mouth with a broken tooth, its shelf of blue and white saucers exposed to any draught or careless elbow. She set down her candle and looked at it the way her father looked at a clock that had stopped keeping faith with the hour, not with alarm, but with the mild, patient curiosity of someone who suspects the fault is smaller than it appears. She ran her thumb along the brass tongue of the latch, felt where it had been forced rather than eased, and asked, without looking up, whether there was tallow in the house, or failing that, a stub of beeswax candle no one would miss. The footman blinked at her, as though she had asked for the moon, but he found the wax. It took her 4 minutes. She warmed the latch's swollen collar between her palms first, the way one might calm a frightened animal before touching it, then worked the wax into the wood's grain with the flat of a knife, patient, unhurried, until the tongue slid home with a small, satisfied click that seemed to surprise the footman more than her. It was the dog, though, that changed how the servants looked at her. It had bolted from the stable yard at the sound of a dropped bucket, a lean gray creature with a rope-scarred neck, and 2 grooms had already failed to corner it among the box hedges, one nursing a bitten wrist, the other red-faced and swearing under his breath about mad beasts and wasted mornings. She came upon the scene by accident, on her way to the orangery with her notebook under her arm, and stopped some 10 feet off, saying nothing, making herself smaller and slower, the way she had learned to be still around a clock's fragile escapement before touching it. She crouched. She did not reach out. She let the animal come to the shape of her stillness in its own time, and when it did, trembling, she laid 2 fingers against its jaw and simply waited, until its breathing slowed to match her own. The grooms told the kitchen told the housekeeper. By evening, the sharp-eyed butler, setting down her candle with his usual unreadable civility, allowed himself one dry observation, that the house seemed, of late, to be full of things that mended themselves when Miss Voss was near them, and things that did not when she was not. She said nothing to that either, but she noted, later, in her small private hand, that patience was the only tool she had ever owned that no creditor could seize. The morning after the incident with the horse, the Duke found himself walking a corridor he had not walked in a year, on a pretext he did not examine too closely. The porcelain room lay at the end of it, its door left ajar by habit rather than invitation, and he told himself he meant only to pass, to check some matter of the estate that could as easily have waited. He did not pass. He stopped at the gap in the door, and through it he watched her. She sat at the long table with her sleeves pinned back and her hair coming loose from its pins in the way it always did by mid-morning, as though it too grew impatient with confinement. Before her lay a saucer, cracked clean through, its glaze the pale celadon green he recognized before his mind had finished deciding to recognize it. She held it the way she had held the horse's trembling jaw, without haste, without pressure, as though the object itself might startle and bolt if handled wrong. He knew the saucer. He had watched a hand that was no longer living lift its twin to a mouth that was no longer living, every morning for 11 years, at the small round table in the breakfast room where the light came in green through the garden trees. He had not thought of that mouth, that light, in some months, had trained himself not to, the way a man trains himself not to touch a burn, and here it was returned to him sideways, through a stranger's careful fingers, in a room that smelled of vinegar and beeswax, and the particular dust of very old things. She was speaking to herself, or to the saucer, in the low half voice she used when she thought herself unheard. Not words exactly, more the tuneless murmur people make over something they are trying not to break. She turned the piece a quarter turn, held it to the light, set down her brush, picked up a finer one. There was no performance in it. That was what struck him hardest, standing in the doorway with his hand still on the frame, that she did this exactly as she had done it with no one watching, that her tenderness toward the broken thing did not increase or diminish for an audience, because she did not know she had one. He should have announced himself. He should, at the very least, have moved. Instead, he stood a long moment with something loosening in his chest that he had no name for and no wish to name, watching a poor clockmaker's daughter mend, with more gentleness than he had managed in a year of trying, the very cup his wife's hand had worn smooth with use. Then he stepped back, quietly, before she could look up and see him seeing her, and went down the corridor with his jaw set and his thoughts in considerably less order than when he had come. He found her again an hour later in the long gallery, where the light through the tall windows had turned the color of weak tea, and he did not trouble himself with pleasantries. "You judge her taste, then," he said, "a cabinet full of it. You look at what my wife chose to love, and you decide, with your little brushes and your little pots of glue, whether she chose well." She did not startle. She set down the shard she had been holding, a fragment of a saucer rim, glazed the blue of a January sky, and folded her hands in her lap before she answered, and the stillness of that gesture cost him more composure than he expected it to. "I judge nothing of her heart, your grace," she said. "I judge only the clay, and the glaze, and the hand that made them, which is a different matter entirely, and one I was taught before I could write my own name. Taught by a man who mends clocks." "By a man who mends clocks," she agreed, "and who taught me that a spring wound a hair too tight will fail in a year, and one wound true will run for 40, and that the difference between the two cannot be seen, only felt, by hands patient enough to feel it. I have spent 11 years learning what patience feels like in my fingers, sir. I did not come here to admire your wife's taste. I came to tell you, piece by piece, what is true and what is false, and I have found nothing yet that dishonors her memory by being told plainly." "Yet," he repeated, and something in his voice sharpened, though whether at the word, or at her steadiness in saying it, she could not tell. "Yet," she said again, without apology, and met his eyes, and did not look away first. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. He looked at her as a man looks at a ledger column that will not sum the way he wishes it to, with irritation, and beneath the irritation, something closer to respect he had not consented to feel. A poor tradesman's daughter, standing in his gallery in a mended gray dress, refusing to be diminished by a duke's temper. It was, he thought, an entirely improper thing for her to do, and entirely more dignity than his own solicitor had managed in a fortnight of visits. "See that it remains plain, then," he said at last, more quietly than before, and turned to go. But at the door he paused, as if some further word had risen and been swallowed, and left without speaking it. Adeline exhaled slowly once his footsteps had faded down the corridor, picked the saucer fragment back up, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that her hands were not shaking at all. The room she had been given for the cataloging work was small and north-facing, chosen, she suspected, because it received the least light and therefore the least chance of anyone lingering there out of curiosity. It suited her. She had never needed generous light so much as steady light, the kind that did not shift and lie about the true color of a glaze. It was in that gray, patient afternoon light that she came to the tea caddy. It sat among the Duchess's smaller effects, a black lacquer box no larger than a prayer book, its brass fittings gone dull with disuse, and she had almost set it aside unopened, thinking it a trifle, until she noticed the weight of it did not match its apparent emptiness. A clockmaker's daughter learns early that objects lie about their insides. Her father had taught her to listen for the false note in a case before ever opening it. The drawer too shallow for the depth of the chest. The hinge placed a half-inch from where honest carpentry would put it. She turned the caddy over in her hands, felt along the base, and found the seam. It took her the better part of 10 minutes to work the panel loose, using nothing but a hairpin and the flat edge of a paring knife she had borrowed, unremarked, from the kitchens. When the false bottom finally gave, it came away with a small, dry sound, like a held breath finally released, and beneath it lay a single folded paper, yellowed at its creases from being opened and closed many times by hands anxious enough to leave the marks of their anxiety upon it. She smoothed it flat upon the table. It was a receipt, in a London dealer's careful commercial hand, for the sale of 3 Kangxi vases, blue and white, the description noted, with the mark of the Kangxi rain, sold 4 months before the date she had already come to know, from the household register, as the date of the Duchess's death. The price recorded was a fraction of what such pieces commanded even in a middling season, a fraction of what she herself, with far less authority than a London dealer, would have named without hesitation. There was no entry for this sale in any ledger she had yet examined, no line in the household accounts, no correspondence referencing it, no note of the proceeds arriving, being spent, being accounted for at all. 3 vases, gone from a collection whose every remaining piece had been catalogued, numbered, and noted with the fussy precision of a woman who loved her possessions as other women loved their children, and these 3 had vanished as though they had never been catalogued at all, sold in haste, sold cheap, and hidden the moment the money changed hands. Adeline sat very still with the paper in her hands, aware of the house settling around her, the far-off sound of a door closing somewhere below, and felt the particular cold that comes not from weather, but from understanding, arriving faster than one wishes it to. She did not move for a long while, and when she did, it was only to draw the candle closer and begin again from the start, not with the register this time, but with the earliest of the appraisal notes she had made herself. The ones she had thought, only days before, were simply the tedious groundwork of her task. She had catalogued each piece by its last known movement, a habit her father had taught her with clock parts long before she had ever touched porcelain. A thing does not vanish, it only goes somewhere unrecorded, and the unrecorded places are where the truth keeps itself. She found the second sale within the hour, folded into a bundle of correspondence she had already passed over twice, dismissing it as household trivia, a note regarding the disposal of certain surplus items of no sentimental value, dated 14 months before the vases, the sum again round, again specific in a way that suggested not a dealer's negotiation, but a debt paid to the exact figure demanded. A third followed, further back still, nearly 2 years distant, smaller than the others, as though whoever required the money had begun modestly and grown bolder with time, or perhaps merely more desperate. She laid the 3 notices side by side on the desk and looked at them the way she might have looked at 3 broken pieces of the same vessel, turning each toward the light to see where the fracture aligned with its neighbor. The sums were not extravagant. That was what struck her most. Not the scale of the losses, but their restraint, their peculiar precision, as though whoever had set the figures had done so not out of greed, but out of some grim arithmetic, demanding exactly enough and never more, the way a tradesman calculates a debt rather than a thief calculates a prize. She thought of the household ledgers she had studied that first week, the Duchess's careful hand recording the price of coal, of candles, of a new bridle for a favored mare, every shilling accounted with the same fastidious love she had given her porcelain, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost unbearable in the quiet of that room, that a woman who kept such records of trifles would never have failed to record 3 vases and their proceeds, unless the recording itself had been the danger. She did not yet know what debt could command such patience, such secrecy, such calm surrender of treasures a woman had loved enough to catalogue like children. But she knew, with the same certainty she brought to a hairline crack beneath old glaze, that she was not looking at extravagance dressed as loss. She was looking at payment, regular, unwilling, and hidden with the particular carefulness of someone protecting not the money, but something far more costly than money, and she sat with that knowledge a long moment before she rose to find where the trail led next. She found the housekeeper in the small parlor off the servants' stair, mending a torn hem by lamplight with the particular stubbornness of a woman who did not care to be idle even after the house had gone quiet. Adeline did not sit at once. She stood near the door as though she might still retreat from what she meant to ask, and when she finally spoke, she kept her voice low and even, the way one might approach a horse that had been startled before. She did not speak of vases, nor of blackmail, nor of the ledger's cold arithmetic. She asked only whether the Duchess had ever seemed troubled in her final year, troubled beyond the ordinary weight of managing a great house. The housekeeper's needle stopped. For a long moment she said nothing, and the lamp hissed softly between them, and Adeline understood that she had touched something the woman had folded away with great care, the way one folds away a morning dress not worn, but not discarded either. "There was a letter," the housekeeper said at last, and her voice had gone thin. "I found her once with it in her lap, in the blue sitting room, past midnight. She was weeping, not loudly, quietly, as she did everything. I asked if I might fetch her something. She said only that some griefs could not be fetched away. She set the mending down upon her knee, her hands suddenly still. I never learned what the letter said. She would not tell me, and I did not press her, for it was not my place, but I watched her burn it in the grate not a fortnight later, and she stood over the ashes longer than seemed natural for a woman burning mere paper." Adeline felt the room grow smaller around that image, the Duchess alone before the fire, feeding her own secret into it stroke by stroke, as though the burning required witness even when no one else was permitted to understand what was being destroyed. "You never asked her again?" "I loved her," the housekeeper said simply, as though this answered everything, and perhaps it did. One does not press a woman one loves to confess her wounds. One waits to be told. But she had not been told, Adeline thought, and neither had she. And now the Duchess was 3 years in her grave, and the telling had fallen instead to a stranger's hands turning over broken porcelain by lamplight, uninvited into a grief that was not hers to inherit. She thanked the housekeeper and withdrew, but the question followed her up the stair like a draught beneath a door. To guard a woman's memory from scrutiny, was that loyalty, or was it merely a kinder name for concealment? The housekeeper had burned nothing herself, yet she had let the burning stand unquestioned for 3 years, and called that mercy. Adeline was no longer certain the distinction held. She only knew that somewhere in that fire had gone the one thing that might have named what the Duchess had been so carefully, so ruinously, paying to keep silent. Mr. Hale arrived on Thursday, 3 days before he was expected, and the household knew it from the sound alone. A carriage driven too fast for the gravel, wheels spitting stone against the library windows like a hard rain arriving out of a clear sky. He did not wait to be announced. He came in shaking water from his hat, though it had not rained, brushing past the footman with the particular briskness of a man who has decided in advance that everyone he is about to meet will waste his time. He found her in the West Gallery, sleeves rolled, a cracked celadon bowl balanced on a folded cloth before her, and he looked at her hands before he looked at her face, as though the hands alone might tell him whether the errand was worth his mourning. "You are the mender," he said. It was not a question. I had understood the Duke employed an expert. "I am employed," she said, "to catalogue and restore. The distinction may interest you less than the porcelain does." He did not smile. He set down his case upon the nearest table without asking leave, and from it drew a ledger of his own, thin and official, the kind of document that made rooms feel smaller the moment it was opened. "Then you will understand," he said, "that a catalogue without provenance is a list of pretty objects and nothing more. Creditors do not settle debts on the strength of pretty objects." He turned a page as though the gesture cost him patience. "I require full provenance for every piece claimed as part of the estate's assets, bills of sale, correspondence, prior ownership, within 4 days. Absent that, I shall be obliged to recommend the entire collection be declared of uncertain title, and therefore withheld from any settlement in the estate's favor." 4 days, Adeline repeated, and something in her chest went very still, the way water goes still just before it is disturbed. "The court does not care for sentiment," he said. mistaking her stillness for grief, or perhaps not troubling to name it at all. Nor, I confess, do I. I have seen too many estates dressed up in the memory of dead wives to be moved by a teacup with a story attached to it. He said this without cruelty, merely the flat conviction of a man who had made his living distrusting exactly such stories, and had never once been wrong enough to doubt the habit. She thought of the ashes in the grate, of the ledger that no longer existed, of the housekeeper's careful loyalty standing now precisely where documentation ought to be. 4 days, she said again, aloud, this time, not to him, but to the bowl before her, to the whole silent room of broken and mended things that had, until this morning, been permitted to keep their secrets. Mr. Hale closed his case with a snap that seemed to settle the matter, and did not see how the sound of it followed her, long after he had gone, into every drawer she had yet to open. She did not go to bed. The house had settled into the particular silence of past midnight, the kind that made every small sound, the settling of coals, the tick of a long case clock 2 rooms distant, seem an intrusion upon something sacred. She lit a second candle beside the first, not for its light, but for the small comfort of doubling it, and drew the tray of remaining pieces toward her across the work table one final time. 4 days. She had spent the first of them proving what could be proven, matching glaze to glaze, foot ring to foot ring, comparing the weight of porcelain in her palm against the weight her memory had learned to trust without her willing it. Genuine, genuine. A copy, competent but cold, its blue, too eager to please. Genuine. She moved through the collection the way her father moved through a clock's workings, not hurrying, not resting, letting her hands do the thinking her mind was too tired to attempt. It was near 2 in the morning when she came to the teacup. She had set it aside days before, on instinct rather than reason, the fairground cup, the one Mr. Hale had waved away with such contempt, the one that had first told her the collection held more than porcelain. She turned it now beneath the candle, feeling again that faint imbalance in the weight, the sound not quite right when she touched a fingernail to its base. She had learned, from years of her father's clocks, that a thing which does not sound as it should has usually been asked to hold something it was never made to hold. The false bottom came away more easily this time, as though it too were tired of keeping secrets. The paper inside had been folded so many times it had gone soft as cloth, and she unfolded it with the same care she gave to a hairline crack, aware that some things break further the moment you stop being gentle with them. The hand was unmistakably the Duchess's. She had seen it now in a dozen inventories, that same looping, hurried elegance. But here it did not list porcelain. It listed a sum. It named, in careful, frightened script, a debt of honor she would not name further, and a person to whom it was owed, referred to only as he who knows, with no name attached, as though the Duchess herself had not dared commit it fully to paper. Adeline read it twice, then a third time, searching for the name that was not there, the secret that was everywhere implied and nowhere stated. She sat a long while with the candle guttering, the note flat beneath her palm, understanding, with the particular cold clarity that comes only at such hours, that she now held something far heavier than a forged vase or a missing ledger. She held the reason the ledger had burned. And she had not yet decided what a person was meant to do with such a thing. The door did not creak so much as sigh, the way old doors do when a house has settled around them for a century, and it was that sigh that made her look up too late to hide anything. He stood in the frame in his shirt sleeves, a single candle in his own hand, wax already pooling crooked over his knuckles, and his eyes went first to the cup, the pale, ruined pieces of it laid out on the cloth like the bones of something small, and then to the paper beneath her palm. "What?" he said, in a voice that had gone very quiet, which she had learned by now was worse than shouting, "Are you hiding?" It was not a question so much as a demand, dressed briefly as one. She did not move her hand from the note. She had learned that too, that the instinct to snatch something away was the surest way to make a man certain it damned you. "A note," she said, in her hand. "Give it to me. In a moment. Now." He crossed the room in 4 strides, and she thought, with the strange detachment of the very tired, that he moved like a man who had spent a great deal of his life being obeyed instantly and had never once considered what it cost the people doing the obeying. He reached for the paper. She did not release it. For a moment they were both holding it, the candlelight trembling over both their hands, and she felt the old brittle fibers of it strain between their grips. "You will tear it," she said. He stopped. Not because she had asked him to, she understood that much about him already, but because the word tear had reached some room in him that still, despite everything, could not bear the thought of further ruin to anything that had been hers. His hand fell away. "Read it to me," he said, and there was something underneath the command now, thin as a hairline crack, that had not been there a moment before. She looked at the shattered cup instead of at him, at the pale curve of it lying open on the cloth like a confession already halfway spoken, and she understood, with the same cold clarity that had held her an hour before, that whatever she said next would decide not merely what he knew, but what kind of man he would become in the knowing of it. "Sit down," she said quietly. "You will want to be sitting." He did not sit, but he did not leave either, and the candle in his hand burned lower, and somewhere beyond the window the first gray suggestion of morning had begun, uninvited, to arrive. He did not sit, but he set the candle down on the table with a care that seemed to cost him something, as though the small act of not spilling wax were the last ordinary motion left to him before whatever came next. She took up the note herself, since his hand had begun, almost imperceptibly, to tremble. Not the tremble of cold, though the room was cold, but the finer, more private tremor of a man approaching a door he has spent years bricking shut. She did not read aloud at once. She let him look first at the hand that had written it, the loops of the letters familiar to him in a way they could never be to her, and she watched something move behind his eyes at the mere sight of that handwriting, some old and unhealed recognition. Then she read. She read it plainly, without softening, because she had already decided, in the space between the shattered cup and this moment, that whatever mercy she meant to offer him would not take the shape of a lie. The words were few: a date, an amount, a line about discretion being worth more than pride. No name. That was the mercy already built into the note itself, whether the Duchess had intended it as such or not, that in her carefulness to protect herself, she had also, unknowingly, left a door through which her husband's grief might still walk without being crushed entirely. His mouth worked before any sound came from it, the jaw tightening and loosening as though testing words and rejecting each in turn. The fire in the grate settled with a small collapse of ash, and in the sudden dimness his face seemed older than she had yet seen it, older than his years, older than the portraits of his father that hung disapprovingly along the east corridor. "She never asked me for money," he said at last, and his voice had none of its usual iron in it. "She never asked me for anything." Adeline said nothing. She had learned, in a shop full of broken things, that silence was often the only vessel large enough to hold a man's first understanding of a loss reshaping itself into something worse. "Who?" he said. Not quite a question, more the beginning of one he could not finish. Who would she have? He did not finish it. He looked instead at the note in her hand as though it might, if stared at long enough, surrender the one thing it had been written expressly to conceal, and Adeline understood that the hardest part of the night was not yet behind them, that the true test of her judgment had only now, in this gray and candlelit hour, begun. She folded the note along its old crease, the paper soft as cloth from years of hiding, and set it down upon the desk between them, as though it were a thing that might still bruise if handled roughly. "I do not know," she said. He looked up at her, and she saw in his face the particular hope of a man who has decided that ignorance is a mercy he cannot quite afford to keep. "You have read it 3 times over," he said. "You will tell me you found nothing?" "I found the fact of the payments," she said. "Sums, dates, the pattern of a woman managing a debt she could not bring to you. I did not find a name. I did not find what was bought with her silence, nor whose silence it was." She paused, and made herself hold his eyes, though it would have been easier, in that moment, to look instead at the fire. "I could have gone further. There were other papers beneath the lining of the case, receipts, a second-hand's writing in the margins of the inventory. I did not read them past what was needed. Why not? It was not asked cruelly. It was asked the way a man asks a question whose answer he suspects will cost him something either way. Because Mr. Hale does not require her reasons, Adeline said. He requires only that the pieces missing from the collection were sold with legitimate cause, and that the estate holds sufficient duplicates and unrecorded stock to satisfy the creditors without further loss. That much I can show him honestly, from the ledgers themselves, without ever showing him this. She touched the note once, lightly, as one touches a wound to confirm it is closed. The rest is not his to know, nor mine, in truth. I have only read farther into her grief than she ever intended anyone to go. He was quiet a long moment. The ash in the grate shifted again, a soft gray sound like a page turning. You could have told him everything, he said slowly, as though testing the shape of the thought. It would have been simpler, more easily defended, if ever questioned. It would have been simpler, she agreed. It would not have been kinder. Something moved behind his eyes then, not gratitude, not yet, but the first uncertain motion toward it. The way a man might look at a locked door he had assumed for years was merely a wall. You have decided this, he said, on my behalf, without asking me. I have decided it, she said, because you could not yet ask. He said nothing to that. He only looked at her, the mender of small broken things, standing in the last light of a dying fire, holding in her two hands the whole of a truth she had chosen not to spend, and for the first time since she had come to Ashworth Hall, he did not look at her as though she were beneath his notice at all. The clock on the mantel struck the half-hour, a thin brass sound that neither of them acknowledged. He moved at last, crossing to the window, though there was nothing beyond it now but darkness and the faint gleam of rain on glass. Hale would have taken it, he said, and been glad of the excuse to close the matter. A tidy report. Fraud discovered, fraud disclosed, the estate's honesty beyond question. He turned. You could have handed him the note and washed your hands of all of it. Why did you not? She did not answer at once. She set down the cloth she had been holding, folded it once, and laid it beside the mended cup, as though the small, ordinary motion might steady what she was about to say. Because a ledger is meant to balance a household, she said finally, not a heart. Mr. Hale wants figures that add correctly. He does not want to know why they did not add correctly to begin with, and he would not have asked. He would only have written it down, and it would have become a fact in a file, read by clerks who never knew her, repeated at dinners by people who never loved her. She looked up. Some things are true and still not owed to everyone who might demand them. And you decide who is owed the truth. I decide what I can carry honestly, she said. The figures balance. The estate is safe. What she suffered to make them balance is not a debt to the creditors. It was never theirs to collect. He was silent long enough that the fire settled again, the last log breaking softly into coals. When he spoke, his voice had lost the edge it had carried since she'd first come into the room. My father, he said, kept every ledger of this house locked in his own hand until the day he died. He believed a man who could account for every shilling had accounted for himself. He looked at the dying fire rather than at her. I have spent 11 years believing the same, that if the sums were right, nothing underneath them mattered. They are not the same thing, she said quietly, a column and a soul. No, he said, I am beginning to understand that they are not. He did not say more. He did not need to. Something in the set of his shoulders had loosened, some old brittle posture he had held so long he had forgotten it was a posture at all, and in its place was something rawer, uncertain, almost young. The rain had begun again outside, faint against the glass, and neither of them moved to break the quiet it made between them. The assessor came on a Tuesday, a small dry man with ink-stained cuffs and the manner of one who trusted numbers more than people, and he spent 4 hours with the catalog spread before him on the library table, like a physician examining a patient he expected to disappoint him. He did not disappoint. She had listed 41 pieces as duplicate ware, sound porcelain, correctly attributed, but doubled in the collection through some old excess of acquisition, pieces that might be sold without diminishing what remained. He turned each entry twice, held 2 pages to the window light, and at last set down his pen, with the particular finality of a man closing a matter rather than merely a ledger. "This will answer," he said. "The creditors will have their sum, and the house need part with nothing that signifies." No one in the room said what they were thinking, which was that a great deal had signified and had already been parted with, quietly, over 11 years, by a woman. None of them could ask about it now. But the figures were sound, and the figures were what the assessor had come for, and by late afternoon he was gone, his carriage wheels cutting fresh tracks through the wet gravel, and the house exhaled in the particular way old houses do when a danger has passed through them and out the other side without lodging. Mrs. Price felt it in her own chest before she named it, a loosening about the ribs she had not known she'd been carrying. She went about her rounds with a lighter tread, and it was on one of these rounds, near dusk, candle in hand, that she came upon the Duke standing in the doorway of the cataloging room. He was not doing anything. That was what struck her. He was simply standing there, in the threshold, looking at the long table where the crates had stood emptied one by one, at the shelf where the small mended teacup still sat catching the last gray light through the window, at the chair pushed back at the angle it had been left when its occupant rose from it that morning to take her leave of the room, if not yet of the house. He did not go in, he did not touch anything. He stood as a man stands at the door of a church after the service has ended, when the singing is gone out of the air, but something of it remains, caught in the stone. Mrs. Price said nothing. She had learned, over many years in that house, precisely when silence was the more faithful service, and she withdrew down the corridor with her candle held low, leaving him to whatever accounting he was making of himself in that empty room, among the ghosts of crates and the one small cup that had, against every reasonable expectation, been made whole again. She left Ashworth Hall on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of pewter, with her father's letter folded twice in her reticule, and the promise of nothing beyond it. The Duke did not come to see her into the carriage. She had not expected him to. The house had already taught her that its master's grief and his gratitude wore the same closed face, and she had stopped trying to read past it days before, when the last crate had been sealed, and the ledger closed, and the solicitor's assessor had gone away satisfied with figures that told a smaller truth than the one she carried folded inside herself, unspoken, likely to remain so. Bristol received her as it always had, the smell of tallow and river mud, the clocks in her father's shop ticking their small disagreements with one another, her father himself, thinner than she liked but steady, his hands still capable of the fine work, though slower now, glad enough to have her back that he did not ask what had kept her so long at a duke's table, only that she had been well fed, and warm, and unharmed. 3 weeks passed in the ordinary rhythm of mended watches and small repairs, and she had nearly stopped listening for the post. Then, on a wet Thursday, a crate arrived. It was not large. It came by carrier from Ashworth, addressed in a clerk's careful hand, and when she pried the lid free and drew back the straw, she found beneath it a breakfast saucer, chipped at the rim in the particular pattern of a fall from a careless hand, packed with a thoroughness that suggested someone had stood over the man doing the packing and watched every handful of straw laid in. There was no note. She turned the saucer over in her hands. It was the piece she had mended in her second week at the hall, the one she had left, unthinking, on the shelf of the cataloging room among the crates, a small private vanity of craft she had not expected anyone to notice, let alone to remember, let alone to send 4 counties distant, with such evident care that not a single fragment of the glaze had chipped further in transit. Her father, watching her from his workbench, said nothing for a long moment, and then only that it was a fine piece of porcelain, and that whoever had sent it must have thought a good deal of the woman who mended it. She did not answer him. She set the saucer on the shelf above her own bench, where the light from the window struck it each morning, and she went back to her work, and if her hands were steadier than usual over the fine screws and the delicate escapements, she did not remark on it, and neither, out of some old habit of kindness, did he. Autumn gave way to a winter mild enough that the shop window could stand uncurtained past 4 o'clock, and her father, who had spent November wrapped in blankets by the stove, took to sitting again in his old chair by the glass, a laprobe over his knees, watching the street with the patient attention of a man who has been reminded, by illness, how much there is worth watching. He mended small things now, a pocket watch spring, the hinge of a snuff box, nothing that taxed his eyes past an hour, but the shop had its clockmaker back in it, however diminished, and she found she could leave him an afternoon at a time without the old fear pressing at her chest. It was on such an afternoon, in the second week of February, that the letter came. The hand on the direction was not one she knew, though the seal, pressed in dark wax, she recognized at once, the same crest that had marked the crate bearing the saucer. She read it standing at the counter, the bell above the door still trembling from the boy who had delivered it, and she read it twice more before she set it down. It was not a summons, it asked. It inquired, with a formality that seemed to have cost the writer some effort, whether a clockmaker's daughter of her particular skill might consider a permanent situation at Ashworth Hall. Cataloging what remained of a collection the house was only beginning to understand, it had never properly reckoned with, and beneath that sentence, in a smaller hand, as though appended after the letter had been thought finished, a line that said the house was learning, slowly, to grieve honestly, and that it had been taught this by hands more patient than its own. Her father, from his chair, asked what news, and she told him only that a house in the north had written wanting a mender, and he said that was no surprise to him, and went back to the spring in his lap, and did not press her further, though she caught him watching her once across the room, with an expression she chose not to name. She did not answer the letter that day. She set it beneath the saucer on the shelf, where the light struck both each morning, and went back to her bench, to the small broken things that came to her from the town, a locket, a teapot lid, a child's toy horse with a cracked ear, mending them one by one, with the same unhurried care she had given the porcelain of a house she might yet return to. It was, she had come to understand, the nature of the work, that a thing broken and set right by patient hands did not merely return to what it had been, it held its seams. It was, in the places that had cracked, stronger than before.